All right, that wasn't too bad. Writing a server in 5 minutes. However, we just wrote a server, but it doesn't really do anything because we don't have all the files we need to actually make it run. We don't have Node. We don't have our index.html. So let's walk through how to even get to the steps to get this server to run. So let's write this Node server, and then we're gonna walk through talking about Homebrew, which is how we install things on OS X. Then we're gonna install Node. Then we're gonna write the world's most basic HTML file, because you need all these things to actually get the server to run. But let's start with the basic Node server. And I'm gonna do this all in Vim. So we can do it wherever, it doesn't matter in the root or not. I'm gonna use my temp directory because I like to keep my file system clean, and I know I will probably clean this up later. So I'm gonna say vi simple server. And this one is not a kind of random file like we touched. So this one's JS, so we're gonna say simple server.js. I'm gonna go to insert mode. So the first thing we need to import from Node is HTTP. So we're saying HTTP require HTTP. So that's just the library that allows us to make requests and response. And this is all built into Node. It's fantastic. We don't have to npm install anything. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to import fs, which is, again, built into Node, allows us to access the file system. Fs, file system, pretty straightforward, just like HTTP, nothing groundbreaking. So fs. And we need to access the file system because, well, we're serving files. We don't actually need to, this isn't actually a necessary step. It is for this exercise, but I can actually just write a response back into, I can write data back to the response, and I never even need to create an HTML file. We're just doing it for this exercise because it's a little bit easier to grok the first time around. Maybe later we'll just write directly to responses, and we don't need any files at all. So next up, I'm going to be a good engineer, and I'm going to define my constants up top. And constants, we like to give all caps to let people know it's a constant and it won't change. You don't necessarily need to do this. You can just write 3000 later down the line. We will dive more into ports and why they're necessary, why we pick 3000. But for now, we're picking 3000. 3000 is generally accepted as an unused port for development. There's nothing that binds to 3000. There are some ports that we'll find out that you can't use. They're already in use, like port 22 is for SSH, port 80 is for HTTP, 443 is for HTTPS. Man, I used to know so many more ports. My memory, it's the gray hair. There are, I forget how many ports. There's a lot.
65,000 something.
65,000? That sounds right. Yeah, so you're not going to really run out of ports. The only chance you have is you might have a port collision. But let's just stick with 3,000. You may see 8,000 in some tutorials. You may see 8080. Those are all fine too. But we define our port. Next, let's define our server. So we'll say const server equals HTTP, built-in library. And not complex, we're going to say create server. Pretty easy. And create server is going to take a function as an argument. Don't mind the way I code. I just like to close off my parentheses early because later I'll be like, why isn't this working? And it's always a missing bracket or parentheses, so I do it ahead of time. Say function. Again, I like to do this ahead of time. So every server, it doesn't matter if it's Node or Tomcats or try to think of Python with Django or Flask or Ruby or Rails. It doesn't matter. Every single server has two basic things. A request, we'll call it rec. You can call it request if you want. And a response, we'll call it res. These are fundamental things of every server. The request coming in, so if someone's making a request to your server, as we said, servers just respond to requests. And the response, what do we tell the request, the person asking? So naturally, when we need to write a response, what do? We do it in a response. So we'll say res or response. We're going to write to the head, which I'll talk about what it means in a second. I'm going to close that off early. So we're writing to the head. So this means the response is made up of a lot of different parts, and maybe a little bit later we can do a console dir and we can dive into what a response actually looks like. It's very, very big. There's a lot of moving parts. But for now, we're going to write directly into that response, into the head of the response. So we're going to give it a 200. 200 is a status code. It just means, OK, everything's good, the most common status code. I'm so excited. We're going to dive way more into these things. We're going to talk about request and response. We're going to talk about status codes, why they're important. They seem trivial, but they're really important. But for now, we're just going to say everything's OK. And we want to be good citizens, so we want to give it a content type. So right now, we are writing a header. Content type. And it's text/HTML. And this is just to help the browser out, to let it know, what are we sending back? I think sometimes you can infer content. It depends on the browser. But we generally want to be as explicit as possible. So there, we just wrote a header as a part of the response. Headers are not part of the response body. They're just metadata attached to the response that says, hey, are you logged in? What are the cookies you have? What's the status code, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on and on about responses. But for now, we wrote 200, and we told it we're sending back an HTML file. Next, we're going to create a read stream. We're not going to write to it. We're just going to read. So we're going to say file system create a readable stream. And we're going to say this fictional file we haven't created yet called index.html. And we're just going to pipe it into the response. Now, streams in Node are, well, they're not new. They were new when Node was invented. But streams are awesome. So instead of loading up these files, and it's really small on this level. It's only going to be like less than a kilobyte. But imagine you had, I don't know, a 20 megabyte PHP file. And if you're like, there's no such thing as a 20 megabyte PHP file, that just tells me you've never written PHP. It is absolutely possible. So in the normal days, you'd have to open that entire file. So you have to load it all in the memory, parse it into your application server or your web server, and then serve it out. But with streams, we just start at the head of the file, and we just pipe that into the response itself. So it's much faster, much more memory efficient. Cognitively, streams can be a little bit harder to deal with because you're not dealing with a static file that's in place. You're dealing with a stream of information. I'm sure there's a front-end master's course on Node.js and where they get way into streams, and I will add it to the slides.
By Scott Moss.
By Scott Moss. Also a former Netflix engineer. There's a theme here about good courses. No, I'm kidding. An amazing instructor and a really nice guy. Yes?
There's a comment about wanting to get syntax highlighting in Vim, and someone said :syntax space on.
Let's try it. I'm a simple man of simple taste. So it's : syntax dash on or just on?
Space on.
Hey, it's hard to see, but that is slightly purple. Pretty nice.
It does look nice.
There's a way. So I think I copied and pasted this code out of VS Code, which copied my syntax over. But really want to get familiar with VI because this is where we're going to be writing all that code. And you can't use VS Code on your server. I mean, you can, but we'll talk about that too, how to do that. All right, and am I missing a bracket? No, I think I got them all. OK, I'm just going to add a semicolon just because I'm a purist like that. So that's our server. Great. Now what? Well, the server's not actually doing anything yet. It doesn't know where to listen. So we have to open that port for it and tell it which port to listen to. That's pretty straightforward. We're going to say server.listen. And we're going to use our constant up top. We'll call it port. And this is just for our own benefits. You don't have to write a console log, but it's nice to know when your server actually ran. Otherwise, it's just an empty process, or it just looks like an empty process. Port, and we're going to say $port. OK. There, you just wrote a Node server, and we walk through each one of these lines and see what they do. Most of these we're going to dive into a bit more about HTTP headers, response codes, things like that. But for now, yeah, that's a server in a couple of lines. But to make it run, we're going to need a little bit extra software, which you may or may not have. Some of these things you may have if you code in your day-to-day. But if you don't, let's walk through how to actually run this right now. So I'm going to write quit. So the file we're missing right now is the index.html. We didn't write it. Let's see what the minimal response we can get to make it say actually work in a browser. So I'm going to say vi index.html. And I'm going to be a rebel here. I'm going to say hello world. And we'll see this totally invalid HTML. We'll see if it works in the browser. OK, next we need Node. I have Node installed. I like to check the version just in case. So I'm running Node 16. I think the latest is 19. Doesn't really matter for this case unless you're running something really old like 8, which I don't know have streams. But this version's OK. And you're like, if you don't have Node installed, let's brew install Node. So we can say brew install Node. It's looking. And Node's already installed on a different version. I'm using something called NVM. I really don't want to go to the rabbit hole of tools because like people are like, oh, but I'm using this and I'm using NPX to do this. And but NVM is pretty awesome too. It lets you switch Node versions on the fly. So I can say NVM use 19. I think I have 19 installed. And I just switched Node versions. Very nice. Highly recommend NVM. But that's not the purpose of this. We really don't have to go down that rabbit hole. I did use something called Homebrew, which if you haven't used it, I'm about to blow your mind again. Like there's a whole world of things to make your life easier. And let's use our Google foo here. And I'm going to do everything as I do in incognito. Not because I'm doing anything nefarious. I just do this by default. I'm really against like tracking on the internet. That's a whole other rant I'll go into. But we'll just type Homebrew. So to install Homebrew, you can just copy this into your terminal. I won't do it because I already have Homebrew installed, and who knows what will happen if I try to install it twice. But Homebrew is a package manager for macOS. Similar to kind of NPM is the Node package manager. Homebrew does that too. It's not anything official. I wouldn't say like Apple's not like, oh yeah, we own Homebrew. But if you've never used Homebrew, it is fantastic for installing things. It makes life so much easier. So if you want to install Homebrew, you brew install Node. And then now we have Node installed. You don't have to use NVM if you don't want to. I think you can brew install NVM too. So you can kind of do a lot. OK. So hopefully you all have Homebrew installed. And let's jump back here. So now I'm going to say node simple server.js. Hey, worked the first time. That almost never happens. Usually I'm missing like something. But this is only a few lines. And so let's navigate back to our browser. So we're going to use localhost. And we're going to say port 3000. The colon gives it a port. Oh, look at that. Our non-HTML page works. In case you didn't know, browsers are really familiar with parsing HTML. You can kind of do whatever you want. You can make up tags, and it'll work. It'll just ignore them if it doesn't understand it. In this case, we're just writing simple text. Nothing super advanced here. However, this might be the simplest HTML file I've ever made. It's not proper HTML. So hopefully you got this far. You wrote a server. You wrote a really simple HTML file. You installed all the files. And now you have a server running. From here, the possibilities are endless. You know? I expect you to have Netflix written in the next couple days, now that you know how to do this. Yeah. Yeah.
Project of a weekend.
Yeah, probably a weekend project, I would say. Yeah, a little more advanced. Next weekend will be, some sort of AI, like ChatGPT 4. We're on the way. We're on the way here. And if you're wondering what localhost is, that's just your local computer. I can also type 127. Anybody know the rest? 0.0. Hey, look at that. The same as localhost. Localhost is just a shortcut for 127.0.0.1. That is a reserved IP. All computers have it. It's just a loopback command. It just says, look at the open ports on my local machine. There are a few other reserved IPs. What's one? This isn't my network, so I'm going to say 192.168. I don't know what's going to pop up here. .0.1? Will it work? I don't know. Probably won't work. That's usually 192.168.0.1 is usually your router. It could be .198.168.1.1 too. So go home and try that out, see what pops up. It's probably going to be your router or your modem. So these are just local addresses that are well known. If you're like, Jem, how do you remember all these things? I don't know. I've just done it enough times that these things kind of build into your muscle memory.
I like to imagine that the browser engineers appreciate how bad we are, and so it's like as permissive a definition of HTML as possible.
Browsers are probably the most forgiving software on the planet. They let you get away with pretty much anything. And couple that with the fact that JavaScript, one of its core features is it's backwards compatible. So that web page you wrote in 2002 in JavaScript will still work today. Actually, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I will gush on about this later, but the internet, in my opinion, is like man's greatest achievements. It's just the amount of work and collaboration, cooperation to make all these things happen, all these different pieces of technology work together without like some overviewing governing body. It's unparalleled. We've never achieved anything else like it in humanity. Anyways, I'm going on. You can tell I love what I do, and I love full stacking it and diving into these things. So hopefully, if you got stuck on something, double check your code. You might be missing a quotation mark or closing a bracket or something like that. Again, the node version doesn't matter as long as it's high enough. The default that you install with Brew should be high enough to run a readable stream.